Hello everybody, I hope you're all well and I hope you're all safe. It's me, Mrs. Richardson, and I'm going to read to you a little bit more of The Iron Man by Ted Hughes. Now this video is all about chapter 3. Now what's a bit different about chapter 3 is that there is a little bit more speech in this chapter between a few of the characters. So first off, I wanted to talk to you about some of the rules that we have for when we are writing direct speech in our writing. So I thought of 6 rules that will really help us out to make sure that we can write our direct speech accurately using the correct punctuation. Okay, so first off, one rule is new speaker, new line. So when a new person starts talking, you need to go on to the next line in your writing. The next rule that I've got here is that we use inverted commas around the speech that is being said. Now, we sometimes will call them the 66 and the 99, just so that we know what they look like. But their real name and their proper name are inverted commas. The next rule that I've got is that we need to use our capital letters. That means that at the start of the speech, we need to use a capital letter to show that a new speech sentence is being said. Okay? The next rule is that we need to make sure that our speech ends with some form of punctuation. Now that doesn't need to be a full stop. That can be a comma, that could be a question mark, or it could be an exclamation mark too, depending on what's being said and how it's being said as well. And the next rule that I've got is that you need to use a reporting clause. Now that is something that tells us who is talking and how they've said it. So you could say she said or he said. But what I really love to see in the writing that I read is when somebody's written something like he exclaimed or she whispered. Something like that makes your writing sound a lot more interesting to read. And the last rule that I've got here is that you must always use a full stop at the end of the whole sentence. So sometimes we get a bit muddled up and we might put the full stop at the end of the speech and then write he said. But actually, at the end of the speech in that situation, you would use a comma, and then after he said, you would then use your full stop there. And I'll hopefully be able to get an example of that up on the screen for you here. Okay, so those are my rules and my top tips for writing speech. And it would be fab if you could maybe have a go at writing some direct speech after you've listened to this chapter. Okay, so chapter 3. What's to be done with the Iron Man? So the spring came round the following year. Leaves unfurled from the buds, daffodils speared up from the soil, and everywhere the grass shook new green points. The round hill over the Iron Man was covered with new grass. Before the end of the summer, sheep were grazing on the fine grass on the lovely hillock. People who had never heard of the Iron Man saw the green hill as they drove past on their way to the sea, and they said, "What a lovely hill! What a perfect place for a picnic!" So people began to picnic on top of the hill. Soon quite a path was worn up there by people climbing to eat their sandwiches and take snaps of each other. One day, a father and a mother, a little boy and a little girl stopped their car and climbed the hill for a picnic. They'd never heard of the Iron Man and they thought the hill had been there forever. They spread a tablecloth on the grass. They sat down their plate of sandwiches, a big pie, a roasted chicken, a bottle of milk, a bowl of tomatoes, a bag full of boiled eggs, a dish of butter, and a loaf of bread with cheese and salt and cups. The father got his stove going to boil some water, and they all lay back on the rugs munching food and waited for the kettle to boil under the blue sky. Suddenly the father said, "That's funny." "What is?" asked the mother. "I felt the ground shake," father said. "Here, right beneath us." "Probably an earthquake in Japan," said the mother. "An earthquake in Japan?" cried the little boy. "How can that be?" So the father began to explain how an earthquake in a far distant country that shakes down buildings and empties lakes sends a jolt right around the earth. People far away in other countries feel it as nothing more than a slight trembling of the ground. An earthquake that knocks a city flat in South America might do no more than shake a picture off a wall in Poland. But as the father was talking, the mother gave a little gasp and a yelp. "The chicken!" she cried. "The cheese! The tomatoes!" Everybody sat up. The tablecloth was sagging in the middle. As they watched, the sag got deeper and all the food fell into it, dragging the tablecloth right down into the ground. The ground underneath was splitting, and the tablecloth, as they watched, slowly folded and disappeared into the crack, and they were left staring at a jagged black crack in the ground. The crack grew, it widened, it lengthened, it ran between them. The mother and the girl were on one side, and the father and the boy were on the other. The little stove toppled into the growing crack with a clatter, and the kettle disappeared. They couldn't believe their eyes. They stared at the widening crack. Then, as they watched, an enormous iron hand came up through the crack, groping around in the air, feeling over the grass on either side of the crack. It nearly touched the little boy, and he rolled over backwards. The mother screamed. "Run to the car!" shouted the father. They all ran. They jumped into the car, they drove, and they didn't look back. So they didn't see the great iron head, square like a bedroom, with red, glaring headlamp eyes, and the tablecloth, still with the chicken and the cheese draped across the top of it, rising out of the top of the hillock, as the Iron Man freed himself from the pit. When the farmers realised that the Iron Man had freed himself, they groaned. What could they do now? They decided to call the army, who could pound him to bits with anti-tank guns, but Hogarth had another idea. At first the farmers wouldn't hear of it, least of all his own father, but at last they agreed. Yes, they would give Hogarth's idea a trial, and if it failed, they would call in the army. After spending a night and a day eating all the barbed wire for miles around, as well as the hinges that he'd torn off gates, and the tin cans he'd found in ditches, and 3 new tractors, 2 cars and a lorry, the Iron Man was resting in a clump of elm trees. There he stood leaning against the huge branches, almost hidden by the dense leaves, his eyes glowing a soft blue. The farmers came near, along a lane in cars, so they could make a quick getaway if things went wrong. They stopped 50 yards from the clump of the elm trees. He really was a monster. This was the first time most of them had had a good look at him. His chest was as big as a cattle truck. His arms were like cranes, and he was getting rusty, probably from eating all of that old barbed wire. Now Hogarth walked up towards the Iron Man. "Hello!" he shouted, and stopped. "Hello, Mr. Iron Man!" The Iron Man made no move. His eyes didn't change. Then Hogarth picked up a rusty old horseshoe, and he knocked it against a stone. Clonk, clonk, clonk. At once the Iron Man's eyes turned darker blue, then purple, then red, and finally white like a car's headlamps. It was the only sign he gave of having heard him. "Mr. Iron Man," shouted Hogarth, "we've got you all the iron you want, all the food you want, and you can have it for nothing, if only you'll just stop eating up our farms." The Iron Man stood up straight. Slowly he turned till he was looking directly at Hogarth. "We're sorry we trapped you and buried you," shouted the boy. "We promise we'll not deceive you again. Follow us. You can have all the metal you want. Brass too, aluminium too, and lots of old chrome. Follow us." The Iron Man pushed aside the boughs and came into the lane. Hogarth joined the farmers. Slowly they drove back down the lane, and slowly, with all the cogs humming, the Iron Man stepped after them. They led through the villages. Half the people came out to stare, half ran to shut themselves inside bedrooms and kitchens. Nobody could believe their eyes when they saw the Iron Man marching behind the farmers. At last they came to the town, and there was a great scrap metal yard. Everything was there. Old cars by the hundred, old trucks, old railway engines, old stoves, old refrigerators, old springs, bedsteads, bicycles, girders, gates, pans. All the scrap of iron in the region was piled up there, rusting away. "There!" cried Hogarth. "Eat all you can!" The Iron Man gazed, and his eyes turned red. He knelt down in the yard. He stretched out on one elbow. He picked up a greasy black stove, and he chewed it like a toffee. These were delicious crumbs of chrome on it. He follows that with a double-decker bedstead and brass knobs that made his eyes crackle with joy. Never before had the Iron Man eaten such delicacies. As he lay there, a big truck turned into the yard and unloaded a pile of rusty chains. The Iron Man lifted a handful, and he let it dangle in his mouth, better than any spaghetti. So there they left him. It was an Iron Man's heaven. The farmers went back to their farms. Hogarth visited the Iron Man every few days. Now the Iron Man's eyes were a constant happy blue. He was no longer rusty. His body gleamed blue, like a new gun barrel, and he ate, and he ate, and he ate endlessly. I wonder if that's the end for the Iron Man, or I wonder if anything will happen next in the story. Did you notice any of the direct speech in that chapter? And do you think that you would be able to write your own conversation between some of the characters? That would be really interesting to see. Well, come back again soon to listen to the next chapter. See you soon. Bye.